vast throne room of the Galactic Emperor shimmered with golden light, reflecting off the polished obsidian walls that towered over the gathered elite. The chamber stretched endlessly, designed to make any visitor feel insignificant before the supreme ruler of the empire. The throne itself was an imposing structure, carved from a single slab of iridescent stone that pulsed faintly as if alive. Around it, the emperor's most trusted officials, high-ranking nobles and warriors of unparalleled skill, stood in rigid formation, their imposing figures casting long shadows on the marble floor. At the center of this grand hall, on his knees, was the human. His hands were bound in energy restraints, his tattered combat armor barely clinging to his body after the brutal capture. Blood, both his and that of his fallen enemies, stained the once pristine fabric. His face bore cuts and bruises, but his eyes, sharp and unwavering, burned with quiet defiance. He did not tremble, did not bow his head in fear, as so many others had in this very hall before him. Instead, he stared directly at the towering figure seated upon the throne. The Galactic Emperor, a being of immense stature, watched the human with a gaze both curious and amused. His crimson robes billowed around him, his elongated, clawed fingers drumming against the armrest of his throne in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. He had seen many warriors, many so-called champions from across the stars, kneeling before him in defeat. Most begged for mercy. Some tried to negotiate. Others broke before they even arrived. But this human, this creature from an insignificant world, he had an air about him that the Emperor could not yet place. To the Emperor's left stood his elite guards, his most loyal and deadly warriors. They were massive, reptilian beings, their scaled hides gleaming under the throne room's dim light. Each of them was clad in heavy ceremonial armor, inscribed with the symbols of their past victories. Their weapons' long, curved blades infused with energy were held at their sides, humming softly with power. One of them, a particularly large brute with a jagged scar across his snout, stepped forward, his lips curling into a sneer. "This is the human that caused such trouble on the battlefield?" His deep, guttural voice echoed through the chamber, dripping with disdain. "I expected something more formidable." Laughter rippled through the ranks of the guards. They had heard the reports of the battle where this human had stood against an entire unit of the Emperor's warriors. The reports claimed he had taken down at least a dozen before finally being subdued. But looking at him now, worn, beaten, and kneeling, they found it hard to believe. The Emperor's lips curled in a smirk as he raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. His golden eyes locked onto the humans. "Tell me, warrior of Earth," he said, his voice smooth yet carrying the weight of authority. "Do you understand where you stand?" The human did not answer immediately. His gaze flicked briefly to the guards, then back to the Emperor. When he spoke, his voice was steady, unyielding. "I stand in the presence of a tyrant who mistakes power for strength." A collective hush fell over the chamber. The guards stiffened, their hands tightening on their weapons. No one spoke to the Emperor in such a way, not without suffering the consequences. The Emperor, however, merely chuckled. He leaned forward slightly, resting his chin on his hand. "Interesting. You are either very brave or very foolish, perhaps both." He gestured to the guards. "And yet, my warriors do not seem impressed by you. They expected a demon of the battlefield, not a battered soldier on his knees." The guard with the scarred snout let out a hissing laugh. Perhaps his reputation was exaggerated, or perhaps his victories were mere luck. He turned his sharp gaze to the human. "Tell me, Earthborn, how did you manage to bring down my brothers? Did you cower in the shadows? Did you use tricks? Or was it simply blind fortune?" The human remained silent, his expression unreadable, the silence stretched, thick with tension. Then, with deliberate slowness, he tilted his head slightly, regarding the guard with an almost amused glint in his eyes. "You think I got lucky?" he finally said, his voice quiet yet carrying through the vast hall. "Then why are you afraid?" The laughter died instantly. The scarred guard's nostrils flared, his grip tightening around his weapon. "Afraid?" he growled. "Of you?" The human smirked. "If you truly believed I was weak, you wouldn't be so desperate to prove it." The Emperor's interest deepened. He had seen arrogance before, but this was not arrogance. It was certainty. Confidence born from experience, not from ego. It was the kind of demeanor he had only ever seen in the greatest of warriors, the ones who knew exactly what they were capable of. A slow grin spread across the Emperor's face. "Enough talk," he declared, rising from his throne. His imposing form loomed over them all, his presence casting an almost tangible weight upon the room. "If my guards doubt your strength, then let them test it. You will fight one of them in the arena. If you survive, perhaps you are worthy of my attention. If not—" He shrugged, as if the outcome was already decided. The scarred guard grinned wickedly, stepping forward with a predatory gleam in his eyes. "I will personally handle this one," he said, rolling his shoulders, "and I will make sure his defeat is entertaining." The human exhaled slowly, as if this entire exchange was nothing more than an inconvenience. He met the guard's gaze, unshaken, unfazed. "I hope you're better than you talk," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. The guard snarled, but said nothing. The Emperor clapped his hands once, and the energy restraints around the human's wrists flickered off. The fight was set, and for the first time, the Emperor's guards began to wonder if they had made a mistake. The arena stretched vast and open beneath the metallic sky, a coliseum of alien grandeur where thousands of spectators gathered to witness combat that would either entertain or terrify them. Jagged obsidian spires loomed over the battlefield, their sharp edges reflecting the eerie green glow of floating orbs that hovered above, illuminating the blood-stained sands below. The air carried a mixture of sweat, metal, and the distant, lingering scent of past deaths. The Galactic Emperor's personal viewing platform stood elevated above the combat grounds, an ominous throne of power from which he observed the unfolding spectacle with a calculated gaze. The human stepped onto the arena floor, his boots sinking slightly into the fine, coarse sand. His shoulders ached from the recent battle that had led to his capture, but his grip on the simple blade he had been allowed was steady. Across from him, the Emperor's chosen champion loomed, a beast of pure muscle wrapped in thick plated armor that shimmered in the artificial light. His forearms flexed, each gripping a different weapon. 2 curved energy blades, a spiked gauntlet, and a chain whip that crackled with an electric hum. The crowd roared in anticipation, eager to see how quickly the human would fall. The Emperor leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes gleaming. "Begin," he said, his voice calm, yet carrying through the Colosseum like a god issuing judgment. The moment the command was given, the champion charged. His massive form crossed the distance between them with terrifying speed, his twin blades slicing through the air in a blur. The human barely had time to move, ducking under the first strike and twisting his body to avoid the second. The sheer force of the missed attack sent a wave of sand spiraling into the air behind him. The human pivoted sharply, lashing out with his blade. The strike aimed for the exposed joint between the champion's armored plates, but the four-armed warrior anticipated it, swinging the electrified chain whip in response. The crackling weapon snapped through the air, forcing the human to retreat. The audience erupted in laughter at the display, at how easily the champion had forced his opponent back. The champion snarled, stepping forward again, this time bringing his spike gauntlet into the fight. He threw a punch with devastating force, aiming to crush his opponent's ribs. The human sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the impact, but the sheer power of the blow sent a tremor through the ground. Sand burst upward in all directions. Without hesitation, the champion twisted his body and swung one of his energy blades, angling it downward in a brutal arc. The human saw the movement and dropped to the ground, rolling beneath the attack just as the glowing weapon sliced through the space where he had stood. In one fluid motion, he pushed off the ground and lunged, his blade finding its mark at last. A sharp clang echoed through the arena. The champion's armor absorbed the hit, but the force of the impact sent him staggering back a step. It was the first time he had been made to yield even slightly. A murmur rippled through the audience. The champion roared, now truly angered. He swung his chain whip in a wide arc, and this time the human was half a second too slowed. The electrified coils wrapped around his forearm, searing his flesh through his tattered armor. Pain jolted through his body like wildfire. The champion grinned, yanking the chain. The human was pulled forward, dragged off balance. In an instant, the four-armed warrior took advantage of the opening, slamming his gauntleted fist into the human's side. The force of the blow sent him sprawling across the sand, his body skidding to a halt near the edge of the arena. The crowd erupted in cheers, convinced the fight was already over. The champion raised one of his blades in triumph, turning slightly to acknowledge the Emperor's presence. But the human was not finished. With a sharp intake of breath, he rolled onto his side, pressing a palm against the sand to steady himself. His vision blurred for a moment, the pain in his ribs making every breath feel like fire. But pain was familiar. Pain was nothing new. He used it, forced it aside, and pushed himself back to his feet. The champion's moment of premature celebration had cost him. He barely had time to turn before the human was upon him, his blade flashing in a vicious strike aimed at the warrior's exposed side. The hit connected. A thin line of dark alien blood seeped from the fresh wound where the human's blade had found its mark. It wasn't deep enough to be lethal, but it was enough to draw a collective gasp from the crowd. The champion's expression twisted in rage. He spun, swinging both energy blades simultaneously, but the human anticipated it. He ducked, rolling forward, and came up behind the champion, slamming the hilt of his weapon against the back of the warrior's skull. The impact sent a jolt through the champion's body, momentarily dazing him. The human did not hesitate. He spun his blade in his grip and drove it upward, aiming directly for the gap between the plates at the base of his opponent's spine. The champion barely managed to twist away in time. The blade sliced across his back instead, another line of blood joining the first. The audience no longer laughed. The Emperor, still seated upon his elevated throne, observed the fight with quiet intrigue. His elite guards, who had once been so eager to mock the human, now stood silent, their expressions unreadable. The champion, breathing heavily, took a step back, reassessing his opponent. The human was not merely surviving, he was fighting back. Worse, he was learning. A low growl rumbled from the champion's throat. He tightened his grip on his weapons and lunged forward once more. The battle was far from over. The champion lunged, his movements fueled by rage and humiliation. His energy blades sang through the air, slicing so fast they left faint trails of light behind them. His chain whip snapped forward, seeking to coil around the human's limbs and end the fight in a single devastating motion. His muscles tensed, prepared to crush and maim, his forearms moving with practiced efficiency. A storm of weaponry that had torn through hundreds before. The human, battered and bleeding, had no room for mistakes. His instincts screamed, his vision narrowed, and he moved. He twisted sideways, narrowly avoiding the crackling whip, feeling its electric hum scorch the air beside his skin. His knees bent, his feet dug into the sand, and he sprang forward, ducking under a wide slash. The champion's lower left blade missed his chest by mere inches, and the human, in a single fluid motion, drove his own weapon upward. Metal met flesh. The blade tore through the exposed joint at the champion's ribcage, cutting deep. The alien's roar of pain split the air, reverberating across the arena. Dark, viscous blood splattered onto the sand. The impact sent the warrior staggering back, his upper right arm instinctively clutching the wound, while his lower arm still gripped his weapons. His breathing now uneven. The crowd erupted into chaos. Some gasped, others shouted in disbelief. The human was not just surviving, he was wounding the Emperor's chosen. The towering warrior who had stood untouchable in so many battles was bleeding, struggling, forced into retreat. But the fight was far from over. With a guttural snarl, the champion surged forward again, swinging with brute force, abandoning precision in favor of raw power. His movements became unpredictable, less calculated than before. The pain had enraged him. The humiliation had shattered his arrogance. He no longer sought to put on a show. He wanted the human broken, crushed into the sand, his body an unrecognizable ruin beneath his boots. The human could see it in his opponent's eyes, the shift from confidence to fury. Rage made creatures reckless. Rage made them blind. The champion's strength was undeniable, his speed unmatched, but he was wounded now, and rage clouded his judgment. The human had seen it before, in battles where men fell to their own emotions rather than their enemy's blade. The champion struck with terrifying force, a downward slash meant to cleave the human in half. The moment the blade came down, the human stepped sideways, pivoting on his heel. The weapon slammed into the sand, kicking up a wave of dust and rock. The champion roared in frustration, yanking the blade free, only to find the human already moving again, circling him like a predator. The chain whip lashed out, its electrified coil snapping toward the human's throat. He ducked just in time, rolling under the strike, his heart hammering against his ribs. The moment he landed, he pushed off with his foot, closing the gap between them. He had no time to think, only to act. His blade struck again, this time at the champion's leg, slicing through muscle just above the knee. The warrior buckled, his balance faltering. He grunted in pain but didn't fall. Instead, he retaliated instantly, using his upper right arm to swing his blade in a deadly arc. The human barely managed to block. The impact sent a jolt through his arm, numbing his fingers, nearly making him drop his weapon. The force of it pushed him backward, his feet skidding across the sand. He steadied himself, shaking off the pain, his grip tightening on the hilt of his blade. The champion, panting, bleeding, glared at him with something new in his gaze. Not just rage, not just hate, but disbelief. The human should have been dead. The human should not have been able to match him, should not have been standing, and yet there he was, chest rising and falling, blood staining his side, but still watching him with that same cold, calculating expression. The Emperor, from his elevated throne, leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes narrowing. His guards, once mocking, now stood in tense silence. The battle had not gone as they had expected. What had begun as amusement had become something else entirely. The champion's breathing grew heavier, his muscles twitching, his grip tightening on his weapons. He had never been pushed this far before. His victories had always been swift, unquestionable, but now he faced an opponent who refused to submit, refused to fall, refused to acknowledge the superiority he had always believed was absolute. Something inside him snapped. With a deafening roar, he launched himself forward, his full weight behind the attack. He swung both energy blades, one high, one low, ensuring the human could not dodge both. His chain whip followed, seeking to coil around an ankle to bring the human down for good. The human had one chance. Instead of dodging backward, he surged forward, stepping directly into the attack. The unexpected movement threw the champion off for a fraction of a second that was all the human needed. He twisted his body at the last moment, the high-energy blade missing his skull by less than an inch. The lower blade grazed his side, drawing blood but not deep enough to slow him. The chain whip missed entirely. And then, the human was inside the champion's guard. With brutal efficiency, he drove his knee into the alien's wounded side, forcing another agonized grunt from the warrior's throat. His left hand shot up, grabbing hold of one of the champion's upper wrists, wrenching it sideways. The alien's grip on his weapon faltered. The human struck. His blade plunged into the warrior's abdomen, sliding between the armored plates. He twisted the hilt. The champion choked on a sharp gasp, his eyes widening. His body trembled, his arms twitching as if his brain could not process what had just happened. The human yanked the blade free and spun away just as the warrior staggered backward, one step, then another. His weapon slipped from his fingers, falling to the sand with dull, final thuds. Silence fell over the arena. The champion, the Emperor's chosen warrior, the undefeated force of the Colosseum, collapsed onto his knees. His breathing was ragged, his hands clutching at the wound in his gut, dark blood spilling between his fingers. His gaze lifted to the human, his expression no longer filled with hate or rage. It was filled with something far worse. Realization. The human had won. The crowd did not cheer. The guards did not speak. Even the Emperor himself remained motionless, watching as his warrior, his pride, his so-called invincible champion, bowed before the one creature that was never supposed to be a threat. The champion, struggling to keep himself upright, lifted his gaze to meet the Emperor's, his jaw tightening. His pride warred with the undeniable truth. He had been bested. He had been outmatched. He had failed. And then, slowly, painfully, he lowered his head, a gesture of submission. The human, still gripping his bloodied blade, exhaled. He did not celebrate, he did not gloat. He simply turned his gaze upward toward the Emperor's throne, waiting, challenging. The fight was over, but the battle was just beginning. The champion remained on his knees, his breath labored, his hands pressed against the wound in his gut. The dark blood pooling beneath him soaked into the sand, a stark contrast against the golden glow of the arena's floating orbs. The human stood before him, his blade still slick with his opponent's lifeblood, his posture unwavering. His chest rose and fell with measured breaths, his expression unreadable as he watched the warrior's strength drain away. Above them, the Galactic Emperor leaned back in his throne, his golden eyes studying the aftermath in silence. His fingers drummed idly against the armrest, his expression unreadable. He had expected entertainment, a swift execution, a moment to indulge in the spectacle of human frailty. Instead, he had witnessed something far more interesting. The silence stretched through the arena, thick with tension. The gathered audience, nobles, soldiers, and warriors alike, watched with uneasy anticipation. None had ever seen an elite warrior of the Emperor's Guard bested in combat. None had ever seen one kneel in defeat. This moment shattered what they believed to be absolute, shaking the foundation of their perceived superiority. The remaining elite guards standing along the perimeter of the arena exchanged brief glances, their expressions betraying nothing. They had mocked the human. They had expected his death. Now, as they looked upon their fallen brother, a seed of doubt coiled in their chests. The champion exhaled sharply and forced his gaze upward. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the shame burning in his chest. He had believed himself untouchable, forged through endless battles, victorious in every encounter before this. Yet now, kneeling before the enemy he had ridiculed, he understood the truth. His failure was absolute. The human met his gaze, his expression unchanged. He did not revel in victory, he did not gloat, he simply watched, waiting for the inevitable. From his throne, the Emperor's voice broke the silence. Stand. The champion hesitated. His hands trembled against the wound, but he forced his muscles to obey. His knees wobbled as he pushed himself upright, his breath hitching with the strain. The pain was secondary now. His pride demanded that he face his Emperor, even if his body screamed for relief. The moment he was on his feet, the Emperor's expression shifted. The amusement in his eyes faded, replaced by something cold and final. You have failed. The champion's chest tightened. He had known the consequences the moment his blade had fallen from his grasp. His fate was sealed. The Emperor lifted a hand in a slow, deliberate motion. The crowd held its breath. The human remained still. The elite guards, standing rigid along the edges of the arena, did not move. They had seen this gesture before. They knew what it meant. The sentence was death. The champion closed his eyes. A flash of movement, a streak of silver, the sound of flesh being torn, a single, choked gasp. The champion staggered. His eyes flew open in shock as he felt the cold bite of steel inside him. His gaze dropped. The human's blade was buried deep in his chest. The human had moved the instant the Emperor had given the order, his speed defying expectation. The strike was clean, efficient, merciful. The champion's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His strength failed him at last, his legs buckling. The human withdrew the blade in one swift motion, stepping back as the towering warrior collapsed forward, his massive frame hitting the sand with a dull, lifeless thud. A single drop of blood slipped from the edge of the human's blade, landing beside the fallen warrior's outstretched hand. Silence reigned. The Emperor watched, his gaze sharp, calculating. His golden eyes flickered from the body to the human, who now stood amidst the carnage he had created. The tension in the arena coiled tighter, suffocating. The elite guards remained motionless, their hands gripping their weapons, but none stepped forward. The human exhaled, adjusting his grip on his sword. He had seen what the Emperor had done. He had not given the order to spare the defeated warrior. He had not acknowledged his service or his previous victories. The Emperor had discarded him the moment he had failed. The human lifted his gaze to the throne. He understood now. This was not just a ruler. This was a man who demanded absolute victory, absolute power. To him, warriors were tools, their worth determined only by success in battle. There was no loyalty here, only survival. The Emperor's lips curled slightly. "You waste no time." The human said nothing. He had no words for the spectacle before him, for the twisted amusement in the Emperor's tone. The Emperor turned his gaze to the remaining elite guards. "Who among you will restore my faith in your strength?" The tension snapped like a taut wire. The elite warriors, once still, shifted. One stepped forward, then another. The human had proven himself, but now the others wanted their chance. To avenge their fallen brother, to reclaim their Emperor's favor, to prove their own dominance. A fight was inevitable. The human tightened his grip on his sword, shifting his stance. He was exhausted, his wounds pulsing with sharp pain, but he had no choice but to face what came next. The Emperor's grin widened as more of his warriors stepped onto the arena floor. The spectacle was not yet over. The sand beneath the human's boots was stained dark, still damp with the blood of the fallen champion. His muscles ached, exhaustion gnawed at his limbs, but he did not let it show. He had no time for weakness. Across from him, the elite guards, the Emperor's finest, stepped forward, their massive forms casting long shadows under the arena's floating orbs. The weight of their presence alone sent ripples through the gathered spectators, a silent promise of the carnage about to unfold. The Emperor watched from his elevated throne, his golden eyes gleaming with satisfaction. This was what he had wanted, a true test, a spectacle, a moment to revel in the brutality that defined his rule. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers laced together in anticipation. The first guard moved. A towering figure, clad in segmented armor, he carried a massive war spear, its tip humming with crackling energy. He did not charge recklessly like the fallen champion before him. He approached with calculated steps, his weapon held steady, his gaze locked on his opponent. The others did not intervene. Not yet. They wanted to see how the human handled one of them before deciding their next move. The human shifted his stance, adjusting his grip on his blade. His opponent was disciplined, methodical. There would be no openings handed to him, no mistakes born of arrogance. He would have to create his own opportunities. The guard struck first, a quick thrust, deceptively fast for someone his size. The human twisted his body just enough to let the spearhead whistle past him, feeling the heat of the energy crackle against his skin. He stepped forward immediately, closing the distance before the guard could retract the weapon, but his opponent anticipated the move. A second strike came from the butt of the spear, aimed at his ribs. The human barely managed to block, his blade absorbing most of the impact. But the force still sent a tremor through his body. The guard pressed forward, not giving him room to counter. He swung the spear in a sweeping arc, forcing the human to duck, then drove his knee upward, aiming for the human's jaw. The human dropped lower, rolling to the side to avoid the attack. He came up on his feet, his mind racing. This one was different, stronger, faster, and unlike the previous opponent, not fueled by rage. He fought with the precision of someone who had never lost. That made him dangerous. The guard advanced again, his spear dancing through the air, each movement controlled and deliberate. The human dodged, weaving through the onslaught, waiting, watching. He could not overpower him, not in raw strength. But strength alone was not victory. The moment came when the guard overextended, a strike aimed too wide, a fraction of a second where the balance shifted. The human reacted instantly. He stepped in, angling his body to avoid the spear's return swing, and slashed at the exposed joint beneath the warrior's shoulder. The blade cut deep. The guard let out a sharp hiss, staggering back, his grip faltering for just a moment. But a moment was all the human needed. He pressed forward, his movements a blur. He drove the hilt of his weapon into the guard's throat, cutting off his breath. The spear dropped from his grasp, and before he could recover, the human's blade found his chest. The second elite guard fell. The arena was silent. The others hesitated now. They had expected vengeance, a swift end to the human's defiance. Instead, they had watched another of their own crumble. The Emperor remained motionless. His golden gaze flickered between the remaining warriors. Enough. The single word cut through the air like a blade. The guards froze. The human did not lower his weapon. The Emperor rose from his throne, descending the steps at a slow, deliberate pace. The crowd parted as he moved, his presence an unspoken force that demanded submission. He stepped onto the arena floor, his robes flowing behind him, his expression unreadable. He stopped a few paces from the human, studying him with quiet intensity. "You are not what I expected," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "You were meant to be nothing more than a distraction, a fleeting moment of entertainment before your inevitable death." The human said nothing. He kept his stance firm, his grip steady. The Emperor tilted his head slightly. "And yet, here you stand. You have slain one of my finest, wounded another, proved yourself in the eyes of those who thought you beneath them." His lips curled into a faint smirk. "Tell me, human, what drives you? What is it that makes you fight?" The human met his gaze, unflinching. "Survival." A beat of silence. Then, soft laughter. The Emperor nodded, as if satisfied with the answer. He turned, glancing toward the elite guards who still stood at the edges of the arena. "He has earned his place," he said, "to stand among us, to fight beside us, or to die by my hand. That choice belongs to him alone." The declaration sent a ripple through the crowd. This was not a mercy, it was a challenge, an invitation into the lion's den where only the strongest survived. The human did not hesitate. He sheathed his blade, straightened his posture, and held the Emperor's gaze. "I choose to fight." The Emperor smiled. "Then fight you shall." The battle was over, but the war had just begun.